Have you ever felt completely invisible in a life you built with your own hands? In psychology, we often talk about the breaking point not as a loud, dramatic explosion, but as a quiet, irreversible moment of clarity. Today's story is about that exact moment. It is a clinical look at what happens when emotional boundaries are repeatedly ignored, and a person decides they no longer need to argue to prove their worth. Let's listen.
She has been a part of this family longer than you. Those were his mother's words. Her tone wasn't vicious. It was just a statement of fact. My grandson deserves to have both his parents under the same roof. David had simply nodded and invited his ex-wife to our Thanksgiving dinner. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I just quietly packed my coat and walked out the front door. Half an hour later, the doorbell chimed, and when David opened it, all the color drained from his face. I can still picture the way the cranberry sauce wobbled in its ceramic bowl that evening. Slow, dark red, glistening under the dining room lights. It is funny how your brain fixates on tiny, irrelevant things when your entire reality is fracturing. It was late November in the Boston suburbs. The kind of biting cold that sinks straight into your joints. Inside his parents' house, the air was thick with the scent of roasting meat, sage, and something else I could no longer recognize. Maybe it was just the smell of distance, or the quiet understanding that my place in this home was gone. David and I had been married for 3 years. For the majority of that time, we lived in his parents' house. Everyone referred to it as a short-term solution, but short-term tends to drag on when the setup works perfectly for the people benefiting from it. When David's startup idea flatlined and rent prices in Cambridge skyrocketed, his mother suggested we take their basement. 2 small rooms, a tiny bathroom, a fridge that buzzed louder than a lawnmower. I agreed because that is what you do in a marriage. You compromise. You make sacrifices. You trust that the hardship is building toward a better future. I quietly covered the bulk of our living expenses. No complaints, no grand gestures. I had a steady income managing corporate accounts at an insurance firm in Framingham. David, on the other hand, was full of concepts. A groundbreaking app, a consulting firm, a buddy who just needed a little seed money. I stood by him through all of it, not with blind faith, but with the steady patience of a partner. His parents saw the dynamic differently. To them, my practical nature was useful, but ultimately replaceable. Sarah, his ex-wife, was different. She was shared history, the kind of history that plants deep roots and refuses to budge. She and David split up 5 years before he met me. They had a son together, Lucas. He was 9 now. A quiet kid with watchful eyes, always taking in more than the adults realized. Sarah lived a couple of towns over in Newton. By all accounts, she was a perfectly nice person. We weren't rivals, not exactly. We were just 2 women circling the same center of gravity, carefully avoiding a crash but never quite relaxing in the same room. Until that evening, David's mother set a platter on the table. The porcelain clicked sharply against the wood. "Did you let her know?" she asked. I paused, my fork hovering over my plate. I caught the look passing between them. It was brief, practiced, and over before I could fully process it. David cleared his throat. He always did that right before delivering bad news. "I asked Sarah to come over for dinner," he said. His voice was overly casual, like he was mentioning a change in the weather. "It just makes sense for Lucas." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Not a physical change, but the air suddenly felt dense. I felt a slow, heavy pressure against my ribs. I waited 1 second. 2, 3. I waited for the rest of the sentence. The part where he would explain why he made this choice. The part that acknowledged this was my Thanksgiving too, even if the house belonged to his parents. Nothing came. His mother offered a faint, satisfied smile. "It is the best thing to do," she chimed in. "Lucas shouldn't have to bounce between houses on a holiday." I lowered my fork. I lined it up perfectly with the rim of my plate. Controlling that small movement felt incredibly necessary right then. "You could have mentioned this to me," I said. My voice sounded flat, almost completely detached. It surprised even me. David offered a half shrug. It wasn't dismissive, but it definitely wasn't an apology. "Well, I'm mentioning it now," he answered. "It is really not a big deal." Not a big deal. I looked around the table. His father was silent, chewing his food. His mother looked entirely resolute. David was already relaxing his shoulders, treating the conversation as closed. And then there was me. I was the only person in the room who hadn't consented to a plan that was already in motion. "She has been a part of this family longer than you," his mother stated. Her tone wasn't malicious. She delivered it like a weather report. "My grandson deserves to have a father and a mother in the same room for one evening." David nodded in agreement. "It is just Thanksgiving," he added. "Don't turn it into a whole thing." But it was already a whole thing. I looked at my husband. I really looked at him. I tried to locate the man I married behind his relaxed expression. The man who used to ask for my thoughts before making a move. He was physically sitting there, but he was buried under years of family alignment. He was choosing the people who had known him longer, people whose definition of family didn't quite stretch far enough to include me. "I'm not turning it into anything," I replied. And as I spoke, I knew it was the absolute truth. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't picking a fight. I wasn't demanding he cancel on her. I was just taking notes. Sarah showed up an hour later, right on the dot. She wore a soft gray knit sweater and denim. Her hair was tied back, making her look surprisingly youthful. Lucas sprinted to the entryway before anyone else. His joy was pure and uncomplicated. He wrapped his arms around his mom, then his dad, checking to make sure his entire world was in the same room. "Hi," Sarah said to me. Her smile was polite and measured. "Happy Thanksgiving." "Happy Thanksgiving," I answered, mirroring her exact tone. We went through the motions, scooping mashed potatoes, passing bread rolls, chatting about the cold front and the traffic on I-95. On the surface, everything functioned normally. Underneath, the gears were grinding. David and Sarah chatted effortlessly. It wasn't flirting. It was just an old familiarity that required zero effort. They chuckled at inside jokes. They shared knowing looks while Lucas told a story about school. With every shared laugh, I felt a quiet shift in my chest. Nothing explosive, just a steady settling of facts. His mother observed them from the head of the table, her satisfaction plainly visible. At one point, I got up to refill the water pitcher at the kitchen counter. I caught my own reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. My expression was blank. My posture was perfectly straight. I asked myself how a person could take up physical space in a room and still be completely invisible. "You're awfully quiet," David murmured later. He leaned against the kitchen doorframe, holding a half-empty wine glass. "I'm listening," I said. He looked at me for a few seconds. Then came that familiar shrug again, the one that shut doors before they could swing open. "Don't overthink it," he told me. "It is just for Lucas." "Just for Lucas," I nodded. There was zero value in fighting a storyline they had all collectively agreed upon. Instead, I finished drying the counter. I folded the dish towel into a neat square and placed it by the sink. "I need to step out for a bit," I told him. David frowned. "Where?" "We're about to slice the pie. I won't be long." Nobody tried to stop me as I grabbed my heavy winter coat. Nobody asked for a destination. Sarah was leaning over Lucas at the table. His mother was stacking dessert plates. His father was brewing coffee. And David had already turned his back, returning to the dining room. My exit was treated as a minor, temporary glitch. The freezing air hit my face the second I opened the front door. It felt sharp and incredibly clean. I took a deep breath, letting the frost clear my head. The suburban street was dead quiet. A few porch lights glowed in the distance. The world out here felt grounded, honest, unfiltered. I slid into my car and pulled the door shut. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, my hands resting on the cold steering wheel. I wasn't in a rush. None of this was a sudden emotional outburst. They would probably assume it was, but they would be wrong. This exit had been under construction for months. It was built on tiny dismissals, on decisions made behind my back, on a pattern I could no longer unsee. I turned the key. 30 minutes later, while that house was undoubtedly full of pie and laughter, the doorbell rang. I wasn't there, but I knew exactly how it played out. David opened the door, probably expecting a neighbor complaining about a parked car. Instead, he got exactly what I arranged for him to get. He would later tell me the first thing he noticed wasn't the stranger's face. It was the manila envelope. Thick, heavy, covered in neat little sticky tabs, the kind of document that screams preparation and finality. A month ago, a folder like that wouldn't have registered in his brain. But right then, Standing in the cozy doorway of his parents' home, it was the only object in focus. "David Harper?" the man asked. His tone was flat. "Professional," David nodded. He was instinctively on guard. "Yeah, can I help you?" The man checked his clipboard. "You've been served," he stated, shoving the thick envelope into David's hands. Behind him, the dinner party rolled on. Silverware clattered against plates. His mother laughed at something. Lucas's voice echoed from the hallway. For a fraction of a second, David froze. He waited for the words to mean something else. "Served?" he echoed. "Divorce papers," the man clarified. He was already stepping back toward his car. "All the details are inside. You have 30 days to file a response." David gripped the edge of the envelope. The weight of the paper felt like a cinder block. "Hold on," he stammered, taking a step onto the porch. "There has to be a mistake." "No mistake," the server replied, completely unfazed. "Have a good night." The front door clicked shut. David stood in the foyer. He stared at the yellow envelope like it was a bomb. He thought if he didn't open it, he could still negotiate his way out of the situation. Then he slowly pivoted toward the dining room. The house felt entirely too warm, too loud, too normal. "Who was at the door?" his mother yelled from the table. David couldn't speak. He walked back into the light, gripping the sealed envelope. His face had morphed from blank confusion into stark panic. Sarah noticed it first. She was always good at reading a room. "What is wrong?" she asked, keeping her voice low. David dropped the folder onto the dining table. It landed with a heavy thud. "It is from her," he said. "He didn't even use my name." His mother scowled. "From who?" "My wife," David choked out. The words seemed to get stuck in his throat. Total silence blanketed the room. It wasn't theatrical. It was just a sudden, absolute stop. Even Lucas put his fork down, sensing the shift in the adult's frequency. David ripped the seal and opened the flap. He started flipping through the pages. The legal jargon was sharp and merciless. Dissolution of marriage, division of assets, mandatory financial disclosure. Every single paragraph proved this had been in the works long before the turkey went into the oven. "What on earth is that?" his mother demanded. She pushed her chair back, the wood scraping against the floor. "What is she trying to pull?" David ignored her. He was actually reading the text now. With every line, the reality sank deeper. "She filed last week," he muttered. "It is already in the system." "Last week?" his mother shrieked. "And you are just hearing about it?" "I didn't know," David snapped back. Sarah leaned across the table. Her forehead creased. "What exactly does it say?" David let out a shaky breath and turned to page 3. "She is requesting full financial disclosure. Bank accounts, investments, credit cards, everything." "That is pretty standard," Sarah offered quietly. David's jaw tightened. A new kind of stiffness took over his posture. "Yeah, but she listed assets I didn't even know were separated." His mother let out a harsh laugh. "What assets? You two don't have anything." David flipped to another page. His eyes darted across the ink. She transferred her direct deposits. She closed the joint checking account. "There is a whole section here on independent holdings." "Independent?" his mother repeated. "You are married. She doesn't have independent anything." David finally looked up. For the first time all night, he looked completely lost. "She always handled the finances," he admitted. "The utilities, the rent, the insurance. I just let her do it." Sarah leaned back in her chair. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Which means she knows exactly where every single dollar is," she noted. "And she secured it before handing this to you." The truth finally hit the floor. "She planned this," David whispered. His mother shook her head furiously. "Planned what? Walking out on Thanksgiving? She is throwing a tantrum. Don't be ridiculous." David kept turning the pages. He was moving slower now. He was searching for a loophole that didn't exist. "She is not making a claim on the house," he pointed out. His mother scoffed. "Obviously, it is my house. She isn't asking for alimony either," David added. "It is a clean break." "Perfect," his mother said, waving her hand. "Then it is easy. You will call her tomorrow. Tell her to stop being dramatic and pull the paperwork." David didn't reply. He was staring at the final sheet of paper. My signature sat at the very bottom. Clean, unshaken, dated 7 days ago. While he was brainstorming his next big business pitch, while we were eating dinner and watching TV, I had systematically dismantled our union. She didn't say a word, he mumbled to himself. Sarah watched him carefully. Maybe she felt like talking wouldn't change anything. "Oh, stop it," his mother interrupted. "She is overreacting. You invite the mother of your child over for dinner, and she suddenly files for divorce? It is insane." David closed the folder. The cardboard slapped the table. "It isn't just about tonight," he said. His voice was dropping. "It is everything." "Everything?" his mother scoffed. What exactly did she lack? She had a roof, a family. What more did she want? David opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The real answer wasn't something his mother was capable of understanding. Sarah stood up and started clearing the dessert plates, offering the room a distraction. Lucas stared at his lap. "Are you going to call her?" Sarah asked quietly. David looked at his cell phone resting near his water glass. He picked it up. The screen was completely blank. No missed calls, no angry texts, no demands for his attention. That silence terrified him more than any screaming match ever could. He dialed my number anyway. It rang 3 times and went straight to voicemail. He slowly put the phone face down on the wood. "She isn't answering," he said. "Let her freeze out there," his mother huffed. "She will come crawling back when she realizes she has nowhere to go." But David knew better. Because looking at that meticulously tabbed folder, he finally understood the difference between throwing a tantrum and taking action. I hadn't argued. I hadn't cried. I had simply moved my pieces across the board, and that made all the difference. I ignored David's calls that Thursday night. I ignored them Friday morning, too. It wasn't a petty game, and it wasn't about punishing him with the silent treatment. It was simply because I had already communicated everything through the only channel he actually respected: paperwork. In our marriage, my spoken words were always minimized. They were debated, twisted, or ignored until I gave up. But legal filings do not argue. They just move forward. I checked into a standard extended stay hotel over in Burlington. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a weekly rate, a functioning kitchenette, and enough quiet for me to think. I unpacked my suitcase, placed my laptop on the small desk, and opened my own copy of the files. Bank ledgers, insurance contracts, W-2s. It was the silent architecture of a life I had built and maintained while everyone around me assumed it ran on autopilot. It is a surreal experience to realize how invisible your labor is until you abruptly stop doing it. For a few days, the lights stay on, the fridge stays cold, then, slowly, the entire machine grinds to a halt. I hadn't stolen a dime. I merely sorted out the tangles. I separated what belonged to me, closed out our joint liabilities, and made sure I walked away with exactly what I earned. Nothing more, nothing less. On Monday morning, I drove to my office in Framingham. The building was quiet and predictable. It was a place where I was valued for my competence, not judged by my utility to a family. Susan, the senior account manager, noticed the shift in my demeanor instantly. She set a fresh cup of coffee near my keyboard. "You look like a woman who just pulled the trigger on a big decision," she observed. Her tone was gentle but sharp. "I did," I told her. "Well then," Susan smiled softly. "Whatever the fallout is, you've got this." I nodded. Because I did. David's text messages piled up as the afternoon wore on. They started out confused. Then they grew worried. Finally, they bordered on frantic. He wanted to know where I was sleeping. He demanded to know why I kept him in the dark. He begged for a sit-down. I read every single message. I didn't rush. My pulse stayed perfectly steady. When 5 o'clock rolled around, I typed exactly one sentence. "We can communicate through the lawyers from now on." It wasn't a vicious text. It was just the protocol. By the time I unlocked my hotel room door, my phone had finally gone quiet. Back in Cambridge, his parents' basement had become a war room. David had spent his entire Monday scrutinizing the divorce petition. He traced his finger under every clause, praying for a loophole or a clerical error. He found nothing. The document was an ironclad fortress. He had already consulted 2 attorneys. One was a college buddy, the other a high-rated local firm. Both of them delivered the exact same verdict. She came prepared. The first lawyer warned him over the phone. "You need to catch up." His mother overheard the call. "Prepared for what?" she sneered. She answers phones at an insurance agency. What kind of master plan could she possibly have? She is an account manager, Mom, David corrected automatically. She handles multi-million-dollar corporate policies. He stopped talking, suddenly realizing he had never bothered to explain my actual career to his parent. Letting them believe I was a low-level clerk had just been easier. His mother waved her hand. It is just pushing paper. David didn't argue. He just stared at the forms. The second lawyer had been much blunter. Did you guys share a checking account? Yes, David answered. She drained her half and closed it, the lawyer stated. What about shared credit cards? We had one. She paid the balance to zero and locked it last Tuesday. The lawyer paused, letting the reality sink into the receiver. Here is the bottom line, David. She limited her financial liability, secured her own cash, and hit you with the papers first. You aren't necessarily screwed, but you are miles behind the starting line. David sat at the kitchen table. The exact same table where we used to eat, takeout, and talk about his future. He tried to reconcile the woman he lived with and the woman who orchestrated this exit. They didn't match. She rerouted her paycheck, he said out loud. His mother was pacing across the linoleum, her arms crossed tight. She did it 2 weeks ago. How on earth could she do that without your permission? His mother demanded. David rubbed his temples. Because it was her bank account. I was just an authorized user. The admission hung heavily in the air. Sarah was still at the house. She had come by to pick up Lucas after school and ended up staying. She possessed a grounded, practical nature that David used to lean on before he started resenting it. Now, that same practicality was staring right at him. You should probably listen to your attorney, Sarah suggested gently, and maybe figure out why she did all this before you go on the offensive. His mother spun around. Are you defending her now? I'm not taking a side, Sarah replied, completely unfazed. I'm just pointing out that people don't spend months secretly planning a divorce unless they feel totally trapped. David let out a long sigh. She never said a word. Sarah tilted her head. Are you absolutely sure about that? That question echoed in David's mind. When he looked past the Thanksgiving dinner, back into the previous months, the blind spots started clearing up. He remembered my quiet requests to go over the budget. He remembered me asking about the timeline for his startup. He remembered me standing in the doorway of the bedroom, just watching him, waiting for a question he never bothered to ask. She tried, David whispered. The realization didn't hit like a lightning bolt. It seeped in like cold water. His mother refused to yield. Even if she did, this is a massive overreaction. You invite your ex to dinner so your son can have a nice holiday, and she blows up her marriage? That is crazy. It wasn't just dinner, Mom, David said, his voice finding some traction. It was a pattern. Sarah gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. What is your next move? David looked at my signature at the bottom of the stack. I'm going to file a response. And then what? His mother pushed. You are just going to let her walk out? David hesitated. The truth was, I hadn't just walked out. I had dismantled the scaffolding holding his daily life together. She is already gone, he said softly. And for the first time, nobody in the room tried to argue. The first week of my absence lacked the explosive drama David anticipated. There were no shouting matches on the front lawn. There were no tearful confrontations. Just total silence and a slow, systemic breakdown of his comfort zone. It started with the Wi-Fi. His father was tapping the router, complaining about the signal dropping. When David called the provider, the representative cheerfully informed him that the account had been closed and transferred to a new address. My address. That is absurd, his mother complained. Tell them to turn it back on. I can't, David said. It was under her name. The utilities followed suit. The electricity and the water weren't shut off, but the billing cycles reset, demanding new deposits and new names on the contracts. Every single shut-off notice highlighted a glaring fact. I was the invisible engine running the house. Without me, the engine didn't explode. It just stalled out, demanding effort nobody wanted to put in. Simultaneously, David's new business venture began to wobble. The angel investor he was courting backed away. The friend who promised him a bridge loan stopped returning texts. It wasn't karma. It was just the reality of building castles in the air without a foundation. Meanwhile, my life settled into a quiet, reliable rhythm. I drank my coffee. I went to the office. I met with my attorney to finalize the disclosures. Everything was handled with cold, hard facts. I didn't want to ruin him. I just wanted my perimeter secured. David finally broke through on day 8. He didn't call. He sent a text that felt drastically different from the first batch. It was short, deflated. "Can we grab a coffee?" No lawyers, just to talk. I read the message 3 times. The frantic entitlement was gone. He was finally realizing that he couldn't charm his way out of this one. I replied, 1 hour, public place. We chose a small cafe in Lexington, right between his town and my office. Neutral territory, quiet enough to hear each other, public enough to prevent a scene. David was already sitting at a corner table when I walked in. Both hands were wrapped around a mug of black coffee. He looked exhausted. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I pulled out my chair. I said I would. We sat in silence for a minute. The air wasn't hostile. It was just intensely cautious. 2 strangers trying to remember a language they used to speak fluently. "I've been going through the filings," he started. "The accounts, the bills. That was the goal," I said. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You handled a lot more than I thought." "Yes. I didn't say it to be petty. It was just the truth. I should have paid closer attention," he admitted. I let the silence hang. I used to rush in to comfort him whenever he admitted a flaw. Not anymore. "I know this isn't just about the bank accounts," he added. "No, it isn't." He leaned back, studying my face like he was trying to crack a code. "If you felt this way, why didn't you just tell me?" I looked him right in the eyes. "I did tell you, David. You just chose not to hear it." He looked down at his coffee mug, tracing the ceramic rim with his thumb. "I really thought we were fine. I thought we were partners," I replied. "That dinner," he started, then paused. "That wasn't the reason, was it?" "The dinner wasn't the start," I explained quietly. "It was just the moment the picture came into focus." "Focus on what? That I made a call without asking you? Focus on the fact that your definition of a family didn't actually have room for me." "That is completely untrue," he said quickly, his voice rising a fraction. I didn't argue back. I just held my ground, keeping eye contact. After a few seconds, his shoulders slumped. "I didn't mean for you to feel like a guest," he said softly. "I know you didn't," I answered. "But intentions don't change the reality." He nodded slowly. "So, what do you want to happen now?" "I want a clean break," I said. "I want a life where I am the priority, not an afterthought." "And what about us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. This was the core of it. Not the division of assets, not the legal jargon, just the inevitable end of the road. "There is no us to go back to," I told him. He closed his eyes. He knew it was coming, but hearing the words still hit him hard. "Do you think we could start over?" I looked at him. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hatred. I just felt incredibly tired. "Maybe in another life," I said. "But not this one." David absorbed the answer. "I'm sorry," he said. And for the very first time in 3 years, it sounded genuine. It wasn't a tactic to avoid conflict. It was just an apology. "I know you are," I said. I stood up from the table. He didn't try to grab my hand or block my path. "Take care of yourself," he offered. "You too." I walked out of the cafe and stepped into the crisp Massachusetts air. I felt lighter. Revenge wasn't about inflicting pain. It was about taking your power back. It was about quietly gathering your worth and leaving the table when the game was rigged. The actual divorce moved slowly. It was a tedious grind of emails, conference calls, and notarized signatures. The shock wore off, replaced by the mundane reality of separating 2 lives. We kept it civilized, mostly for Lucas. He was young, but kids absorb everything. They need to see that adults can dismantle a family without trying to destroy each other in the process. David's parents eventually stopped fighting the narrative. The turning point was subtle. One afternoon, his mother emailed me directly asking for help decoding an old tax form. She didn't CC David. She just reached out to the one person she knew could fix the problem. I emailed her the solution. She replied with a simple, "Thank you." It wasn't an olive branch, but it was a white flag. Sarah and I found an unspoken peace. We ran into each other at a coffee shop near Lucas's school a few months later. We stood by the counter, waiting for our lattes. "I never wanted it to explode like that," she told me quietly. I know, I said. I just wanted him to have a normal Thanksgiving. So did I. Sarah looked at me and nodded. Have a good life. You too. When the final decree arrived in the mail, I was sitting in my new townhouse in Concord. It was small, but it was mine. I bought the furniture. I paid the mortgage. I arranged the living room exactly how I wanted it. I signed the final page and set the pen down. There were no fireworks, no dramatic tears, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the knowledge that my time belonged entirely to me again. Sometimes, I look back at that freezing November night, not with anger, but with profound clarity. It wasn't a tragedy, it was an awakening. True respect doesn't come from years of loyalty or shared history. It comes from recognition. And if the people around you cannot recognize your value, you don't scream to make them hear you. You just pack your coat, secure your assets, and walk out the front door. If this story struck a chord with you, or if you have ever felt invisible in a room you helped build, take a moment to evaluate your own boundaries. Share this with someone who needs the courage to walk away. And if you want to hear more stories about real life, resilience, and quiet strength, hit the subscribe button.
Asterisk. What we just witnessed is a textbook psychological response known as emotional detachment, often seen in the final stages of a declining marriage. When a partner realizes their voice no longer holds weight, they stop arguing, not because they agree, but because they are protecting their peace. Our protagonist didn't act out of vindictiveness. She acted out of self-preservation. She reclaimed her agency by organizing her exit long before she walked out that door. The psychological takeaway here is profound. True respect isn't negotiated. It is recognized. If you find yourself constantly over-explaining your basic needs to someone who refuses to listen, perhaps it's time to stop talking and start planning your next step. Asterisk.